Rachel Romer Carlson is the co-founder and CEO of Guild Education, which works with some of the largest employers in the country to help transform their education and upskilling programs. I just described it kind of like mundanely. It's a huge deal what you've done. And you work with huge companies, Walt Disney, Discover, Walmart, Waste Man. I mean, like you name it, you've been working it, and you have 1,000. So I just want to tip my hat because I didn't know much about this before, Rachel. But I also want to just start maybe in a non-traditional way. I become quite taken with this. Twitter line. I know you can't see this, but this is a tweet that you were sharing about thinking about stimulus, people on the couch, the nature of work. And you gave kind of an education to people and said, look, if you want to know how a healthy economy works, this is one of the things that we've been underinvesting in certain elements. I'm going to let you describe, before we get into Guild, I just think it's an incredibly interesting lesson. Share with us what the message were you were trying to get to people.
Sure. Glad to know that someone besides my mom reads my Twitter account. So I think we have lost the thread on a big chunk of the American dream, which is the belief that I can do better than the last generation that raised me, right? That's a story that so many Americans tell. And the way you do that is you unlock opportunity for people. And there are a lot of ways to unlock opportunity, but the most successful in American history, and the thing that the data tells us today remains the most successful tool for unlocking opportunity, is education. The complicated part, because I agree with almost everything that Anthony just shared, is that education somehow got tangled up with this idea of a degree. And we need to be talking about the deliverance of skills to workers. And that may come with a degree or a credential or something else, but how are we making skills widely accessible to folks? And we're actually seeing that workers care about that at such a strong form and fashion that it is now the thing that millennials and Gen Z are saying they look for most from their employers. And it's the thing that's driving new behavior to get some people back to work. And I think, the thing I took issue with, if I remember that thread correctly, is I don't buy that all these folks are sitting on the couch waiting for their stimulus to dry up. The people we talk to are the 4 million working moms who don't have safe childcare still 18 months into COVID, the boomers who got put out of the workforce because they don't have the technical skills anymore. Those are the populations that I think we should be talking about.
I couldn't agree more. And I'm so happy that you raised that, because it's an area, I often think about who are we not reaching? If you're going to talk about diversity, inclusion, you're going to look across the board. A lot of people have become essentially depressed about being in this. They've pulled themselves out and they're waiting for circumstances to change. But now let's go into Guild. And I'm trying to understand, as we've talked to many, I sort of feel like today we're having the Emmys, if you will, of those people who are doing great things, in the upskilling story. I'm getting a great education in this. But tell us what your approach is. And you also, this is a company that you founded, and it's grown amazingly well. You've won all these awards. You're valued at over $1 billion in what you're doing. If you can tell us, what's the secret sauce of how you're doing it, and what should other players in this? Because I asked Anthony earlier, I said, I'm wondering if I'm talking to a bunch of boutiques, or am I talking to companies and organizations that are getting set scale in this time, that we're actually going to begin to solve some of these gaps that we have with skills and jobs?
It's so interesting you said scale. That's why we exist. So I spent my time, after spending some time in Washington, I had the joy of being on the 2008 Obama campaign, and then as a peon of sorts in the White House, where I got to learn a lot. I'm not sure I contributed much. I spent some time across the U.S. in our higher ed systems, primarily in two-year colleges. And what I saw was time and time again, we were poorly serving the new normal learner, right? These two-year schools and many of our four-year schools were set up to serve an 18-year-old who's going to go to school full-time. Classes are 80% between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m., which is when America works. There wasn't childcare, and there wasn't connection to career. Folks felt like they were doing high school 2.0, being put in gen ed courses that had nothing to do, by the way, with the job they had. And 70% of the students had jobs, and they were trying to find this connection between jobs and their work. And so I wrote a big research plan tied to Guild, worked on it with folks across Stanford School of Ed and a variety of the other faculty members. But we almost started it as a nonprofit. And ultimately, why we raised impact investing and why we're a company is that we realized we needed to scale this thing nationally, and we needed to actually be a technology and payments company. The thing holding the vast majority of the 88 million Americans we wanted to serve back from going back to school was funding. And there was all this funding available between the federal government and employers and organizations, but in many cases, they weren't able to access that funding to go back to school. And in particular, the employers wanted them to pay up front and then wait to get reimbursed at the end of the year. And that works for your chief accounting officer and for the team filing those reimbursements. But for a frontline worker at Chipotle, who has, average American has $400 in their checking and banking account, spending $5,000 up front, which sometimes sounds cheap to policymakers, simply not. And we needed to eliminate the cost so that people could go back to school without fronting the money, without putting it on a credit card, without going to a payday lender.
So who becomes your partners? Is it the company, like the large-scale company, like a Walmart or others, or does it start with that worker at some level on an individual level, or is it both?
Yeah, it's confusing. We're a three-sided marketplace. So we start with solving the needs of the 88 million Americans we want to serve. We then spent a bunch of time with the universities and learning providers who are now one side of our marketplace. And what they told us was that the main thing holding them back from connecting with the workforce that they wanted to serve was actually the acquisition, the marketing, the digital advertising. And I don't think I'm teaching you anything to say that there's 2 or 3 companies that make all the money in digital advertising in America. But the shocking fact is that higher ed is often their largest industry. And they're making on average $5,000 for a bachelor's degree student and $15,000 in marketing costs per master's degree student. And so when you help good public and nonprofit universities no longer have to spend all of that money to meet the student they want to serve, they suddenly have a surplus of funds. And so the way our business model works is they take that savings that no longer goes to digital marketing and advertising, and they spend it to lower the cost of tuition, right? So they bring costs down. They pay for all of our technology, payments, and coaching services for the student. And then they keep some themselves to invest in what those public institutions often do best, which is instruction and curriculum. So the employers are our partners. They get a lot of press, and people often think of them as our client, but they're not. They're a partner, and we're paid by the nonprofit and public institutions we work with.
It's a really, really fascinating model. As you work with these, universities and colleges, and you said you were with 2-year programs, as I see it, there's a lot of innovation of what they're trying to do to, get people credentials. And we were just talking to the president of Miami-Dade College about stacked credentials. I've interviewed the CEO of AT&T before about, the nano degree that they have internally. Every employee inside AT&T from whatever level, gets a certain basic skill set, and then hopefully that nano degree goes on their Vita and they can, use it in other ways. So I guess, are you seeing any I don't know how to put it, any patterns where what looks uncomfortable to some who don't know this arena well, 4-year college degrees at these Ivy League or top-end schools, grabbing a certain portion of the marketplace and as being the goal that was imposed, stigma for everyone else that didn't go do that. Are you seeing healthy patterns in your company develop that we're going to be able to celebrate and say, this is smart, this is nimble, this is pragmatic, and these people are living fulfilling lives that they want to? I don't know how to put it any other way than that, but I'd love to hear the competition to that other model.
I love this topic. So when I was studying in grad school under Dr. Eric Bettinger, he taught us about this idea that higher ed is this confusing combination of skills and signal. And we really can't tell the difference, right? When someone hires a graduate of Harvard, are they hiring them because of the skills we know they acquired, or because of the signal of Harvard's degree, or some combination? And what the labor data tells us is that traditionally in the US, all of the economic value only arrives when you get that credential, when you can display that signal. What we are doing at Guild and seeing the data start to come to fruition is that when you bring employers and learning partners together to the conversation of what is in this skill, what are the competencies, what is the learner learning, you start to see the learners grab economic value as they're learning, which is what one would expect, right? If you've completed a year of college, you've learned a year of skills. The labor economy should reward you for that, not at the end of 4 years. And so we're now actually in this closed loop system where that feedback loop is driving. I'll give you my favorite stat that Chipotle's chief people officer just shared, which is that their employees who are engaging in these learning programs are being promoted at 7.5x the rate of employees who are not in the learning program. Same job, same title, but the ones who are gaining new skills are moving into the middle class at 7.5x the rate. And so we see similar data when we look at it on a demographic basis amongst our Black talent that are getting promoted at a significantly higher rate than Black talent not in learning programs. So when we talk about these issues of economic mobility and diversity and equity and inclusion, we're finally seeing the data that if we help a frontline worker understand their skills, they can move up the economic ladder before or in spite of whether they do or don't have a degree, so long as they can communicate those skills.
Rachel, just finally, we've got Senator Mike Braun is going to join us here in a minute. And I love that you described yourself as one time a peon in the Obama White House doing this and others. And now you're running this giant company, fixing America's problems. Let me just ask you in just a friendly way, you know the policy crowd, you know members of government, you know folks in the administration. What's the biggest blind spot they have from a policy perspective about the sort of work you're doing? I'm sure there's a gap between what you're doing in the private sector, your partners, and how the policy world sees it. What would be the biggest thing that would help them to orient themselves better than they are now?
Yeah, fun question. Two things. First, I think for too long, we have measured universities on the wrong things. You look at IPEDS, which is the federal data set, and we're big supporters of the bipartisan College Transparency Act. But we have to have transparency across all of our schools and what they're providing. In particular, we still have too many senators, too many policymakers, and too many think tanks who want to measure schools based on how much we pay faculty. And in business, you don't measure anything based on inputs. Inputs are relevant, but only as indicators of outputs. And unfortunately, we now have our own database that we've been building over 10 years, and we see very low correlation with the direction between faculty investment and this muddy set of data and whether low-income students are getting what they need. We want faculty to be paid well. I'm a happy recipient of really well-sponsored faculty, but that can't be how we solely evaluate higher ed. Part two would be this idea of helping employers align incentives. Unfortunately, I think there is a movement afoot of saying, hey, we need the one group to spend more, and I am a believer of putting more funding behind the college dollars that are available to the American workforce, so big supporter of the Free College Initiative. But if we do that in a way that disincentivizes employers to fund, we're leaving $60 billion behind, because that's how much employers are spending today. And so if you can instead align the incentives of the private sector to continue funding their workforce, you actually get to lift what is available to fund skills in higher ed for our workforce by $60 billion.
Wow, it's incredible. Well, Rachel Romer Carlson, co-founder and CEO of Guild Education. What a fascinating discussion. I'm excited by the stuff you're doing. Thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. This was really fun. Thank you.
Thank you.